List of discontinued operating systems. List of subduction zones. List of lost islands. List of abandoned oil platforms. List of obsolete calendars. List of past geological supereons. List of voids. List of obsolete medical terminology. List of missing artworks. List of former nations, states, empires and monarchies. List of cured diseases. List of solids that sublime. List of recessions. List of obsolete tools. List of archaic nomenclature for metals. List of radio quiet zones. List of unassigned country calling codes. List of drying lakes. List of former national anthems. List of images to have left the solar system. List of known black holes. List of lost oceanic habitats. List of lost archives. List of extinct volcanoes. List of disbanded political parties. List of destroyed mosques. List of dinosaurs. List of defunct submarines.
Hello everyone. Thanks a lot for coming. It's a pleasure to welcome you here tonight at the daadgalerie. My name is Melanie Romigier. I'm the head of the visual arts section of the Berliner Künstlerprogramm, the Artist in Berlin program of the DAD. And I'm very pleased to have as our guest tonight artist and former resident of the DAD Artist in Berlin program, Dane Mitchell, artist and writer Heman Chong, and unfortunately, Chris Sharp cannot be here with us tonight as planned, but we're very happy that we have Övül Durmusoglu with us, which will lead us through the evening and the conversation and hopefully questions we also might have later. As the title of today's event, Soft Rains-Progress and Obsolescence, indicates, the role and meaning of subtraction and withdrawal when it comes to the question of contemporary forms of representation will be the main topic of our conversation today. We are very curious to learn more about the connection of your work, Dane and Heman, while looking at your practice through that lens and discovering common grounds. And also to see how the question of obsolescence and the concept of negative accumulation is a leading motivation for your project, Dane, called Postdoc for the New Zealand Pavilion in Venice this year. Thank you all very much for being here. I look very much forward to hear your conversation and also hope that we will find a way later to also get into a dialogue about the seen and heard in the course of the evening. Yeah. I would like to thank Creative New Zealand and Elizabeth Flanagan as Ute Weingarten to work with us as partners and make this event possible tonight, and also New Zealand Embassy for the support. Before I pass the floor to Dane, Heman and Övül, I would like to introduce our speakers briefly. Dane Mitchell was born in New Zealand and is an artist whose practice is primarily concerned with the physical properties of the intangible and visible manifestation of other dimensions. His work speculates on what is material and explores systems of knowledge or belief, our experiences of them. Dane's exhibition history dates back to 1999. Since 2008, he has presented solo exhibitions both nationally and internationally in public institutions in Germany, including the daadgalerie in 2009, and in countries including Brazil, the Netherlands, Switzerland, France, the United States, and others. That's only a selection, of course. Alongside this, he has participated in a number of group exhibitions and biennials, including Biennale of Sydney, Guangzhou, Liverpool, and some more. Later this year, he will present his new project Postdoc at the New Zealand Pavilion at the 58th Venice Biennale. Heman Chong is an artist whose work is located at the intersection between image, performance, situations, and writing. His practice can be read as an imagining, interrogation, sometimes intervention, into infrastructure as an everyday medium of politics. His work has been the subject of solo exhibition at Swiss Institute New York, Art in General, Rockbound Art Museum, South London Gallery, amongst many others. Chong is the co-director and founder, with René Stahl, of the Liberty of Unread Books, a library made up of donated books, previously unread by the owners. He is currently working on a novel, The Book of Drafts, which will be published by Poly Parenthesis in 2020. Övül Durmusoglu was born in Turkey and has a background in visual arts theory and cultural studies. She works as a curator and writer and is based in Berlin. Currently, she's a guest curator at the Muhammad and Mahera Abu Ghazaleh Foundation in Amman. Apart from that, she holds a position as visiting curator at Linz University of the Arts and is part of the editorial committee of South as a State of Mind in Athens. She has curated exhibitions in different international institutions, festivals, and was a grant holder of research grants by Humes Foundation in Mexico, Zaha Foundation in Istanbul, and Goethe Institute Fellowship, joining the team of Documenta 13 in 2012. So, thank you again for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Melanie.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, all. I am very happy to be the person mediating the conversation, greeting Dane in Berlin after a very long time,
Sure.
and after the time of your DAAD residency. And I'm also very happy that actually I'm introduced into the depth of his exciting practice. I would love to start with Zara Stanhope's words, who is also one of the co-directors, co-curators of the pavilion. I think she has a way of describing description for your work, which really, I think, is a good beginning for us, like to initiate a conversation here. That you have a practice of establishing scenarios in which nothingness becomes part of experience and which provokes us to question what exactly is at stake and how we should respond. Of course, indeed, that you have this, let's say, unstoppable interest in the transmission between material and immaterial and back and forth, and you play around like also historical conceptual methodologies like with it. But I also believe like post hoc takes your whole this understanding of your practice also to a next level. Can we learn what is like the personal necessity and drivers? What stands behind the post hoc project, and especially at this particular moment?
Okay, kia ora, hello everybody, thank you for being here. You guys are way more lit than everybody out there.
It's
so
true.
I sort of feel like I'm, there's people, someone's out. So yeah, thank you for being here. So I guess it's a long-standing interest in somehow thinking about these unseen forces, that circulate and accumulate and are omnipresent. They're everywhere, and it's a way for me to think about the way this logic or this illogic of the unseen being a seething presence or a force in our lives, that all kinds of unseen entities, models, forms have a kind of weight. They have a sculptural weight, but they have a political weight, a critical weight, and an aesthetic weight. I don't know how this relates to me personally, but we were laughing as we were kind of talking earlier tonight. That coming from Aotearoa, New Zealand, it's a country that often falls off international maps when in various contexts. So, for example, you can be watching the news in a country, and the backdrop of graphics representing the world, New Zealand sort of falls off the map quite often. And I started to wonder whether that wasn't why I was so interested in invisibility. Yeah. I'm not sure.
I'm pretty sure.
But yeah, it has been an ongoing concern. And Post Hoc, which is this new project that I'm working on, and which is completely saturating my every waking moment for Venice, is certainly an accumulative force that addresses these interests and concerns. And I mean, we're talking about something that's abstract because we haven't described what this project is, and I'm sure we'll get to that. But yeah, I don't know. Is that a way to start? Should we talk a little bit? Do you want me to talk a little bit about the project?
I think it would be nice, like, to
a little rundown.
A little rundown,
Yeah.
here,
Yeah.
so that we can continue further.
Sure. So the project for Venice is titled Post Hoc. And at the heart of this project, at the center of this project, is a list. It's an enormous list. It's a list of names of things that once were that are no longer, things that have vanished, things that have withdrawn, things that have gone, things that have become obsolete, or forces of obsolescence, forces of vanishing, things that might allow for vanishing acts to occur. So this list is a sort of superabundance, and it's my intention that the list is read, that it's read throughout the exhibition. The exhibition runs for 7 months. The lists begin on the first day being read by a synthetic voice that you heard at the beginning of just before we started speaking, and the lists read every day for 7 months, so 6 days a week, 8 hours a day. And they never repeat. So it's a list that is, the list, there's I think it's 270 lists, and this is the list of lists that is on the screen here. And then each of these lists is populated with content, and by way of a speech act, by way of, thinking about the way saying something makes it so, that somehow speaking produces realities, that this act of speech is a kind of material force. So in a way, I'm thinking about the incantation or utterance as a kind of conjuring trick, as a way of calling up all of this material momentarily in the present before it drifts back into the past or sunken below us. And these lists are transmitted. They are transmitted across the pavilion in a way that, well, I could speak about some more soon. I think maybe if we just stop at the lists for a moment, and then I'll say something about the title. Post hoc translates directly to after this. And so in a way, it's an acknowledgement that we live in a moment of after this material, that we live in a moment of afterness, be that environmental, be that political, be that materially. But it comes from a longer phrase, post hoc ergo propter hoc, which is after this, therefore because this. And it's a phrase that suggests that we should be careful, we should be careful to assume causal links between events, that we should be suspicious of a cause and effect between two things in time. So in a way, it's an attempt to disentangle the lists from being a moral lesson, for me at least.
Heman, maybe it would be nice that you come in here and speak how you start to be involved in the project, because you have a really beautiful fiction also that will come as part of the publication. So it would be nice to hear that before.
Yes.
Yeah.
So my role in this project is very specific. I've been asked by Dane and Zara and Chris to write something for the catalog. And in fact, when I was talking to Dane over the phone, I was in this stream when I was very heavily involved in my novel. And actually, there was no way I could have taken on another text outside of the novel. And in that conversation, we had immediately decided two things. The first being that I would become one of the gatherers of a category of this list, amongst other gatherers. And the second thing would be that the text for the book would be a chapter of my novel. So it's there's a lot of entanglements involved in this commission, simply because I have to then involve my protagonist in looking at Dane's project. Exactly, and also to get her to think about the list, which is very different from me thinking about the list. So there is a kind of meta-transaction involved, I feel, which processes post hoc into the realm of fiction. And I think that, in a way, texts like these work well in describing artworks because it can do so. It comes across within a language that is very conversational. I think that's very important, rather than something that is didactic. And there's also, I was also flying blind in a way. I didn't read like the text from the catalog. So I didn't know what, like editorially, I didn't know how.
You find your own way also.
Yes, I think that was also deliberate.
Yeah, for sure.
But I think at the same time, it's very interesting to be a part of the list that actually my story is anchored into something very real, because I would get like a text message from Dane like 3 a.m, like, "Are you looking at Wikipedia? I need the fucking list now."
I didn't swear.
And I was like, whatever, And then I had to get my character to do it, because one of the main conversations we have, and by the way, my list was that I've chosen for my character to take on is the list of lost and destroyed manuscripts, which is different from a destroyed book, because a book is published and have been distributed, but then someone would have gone to that intention of like destroying every copy.
Like you have a personal relationship
yes,
to that.
I do.
Also.
Yeah, I do. But manuscripts it's very hard to actually put together a list of manuscripts, because most authors, when they destroy a manuscript, it's a secret. A lot of this information is not accessible. So actually the list is quite short. It's true, it's quite short. At least the information that's available in public. So I actually had called up many writers and asked them, like, do you have a book you've destroyed?
Okay.
So I did do a lot of field work. But the thing is, like, I think most authors don't want to say it. I think that's interesting for me, that they don't want to like talk about something they've destroyed. So I think that's interesting, yeah.
But so you don't want to talk about your own
No.
destroyed manuscript?
Oh, I mean, I was just talking to Övül that I had worked on the book for about like 7 years, and when I finished it, I read it and it wasn't very good, and I deleted it.
Does it feature on the list?
Yes.
Yeah, good, it does.
That's why.
I'm not lying about it.
But may I follow with the question, like how because you said your protagonist Anna O's feeling or reaction to the list is different than yours.
Yes, it's very different.
Can you open up a little bit for us, like that difference?
Yes. For a start, she's a woman. And I think that's there's a huge gender difference, and I don't want to. Anna O for me is not an autobiographical mode. Mm-hmm. Like I literally, when I write the story with a female protagonist, I have to empathize. So I think that empathy changes the selection of things that go into the list, and also I think that there are all the sort of like things that she would consider that I wouldn't. It's a hot mess, let's say. Mm-hmm. There's all these things that she would consider that I wouldn't consider to be in the list and things like that. So it's a kind of, it's a very, for me, a very complex way of thinking about your project, let's say.
I mean, thinking about like fiction and stories, here I would love to like bring in Donna Haraway's ideas about storytelling. In the last film, like in Fabrizio Terranova's film, Storytelling for Earthly Survival, she really mentions about like storytelling as a way to change the world, and how does a story actually can enact this power, and actually like we need to use the storytelling to make more invisible stories, like non-existent stories, more visible, while rendering the more dominant stories less potent. In a way, I find this very interesting relationship with, let's say, with your list of like exhaustion and destruction, that you are actually telling us another story. So, but now that I know that the work is in production, what kind of story that you are telling? Or how are you feeling, like this kind of about this narrativity in the work?
Yeah, I think storytelling is something that's kind of come late to the work for me in terms of my reading of it or thinking about it. But it's certainly the case that early on it was important that the lists are experienced as something temporal, something that happens through speech, and not as a readable event, let's say, as printed, or let's say less tangible, which I think connects really beautifully to the foundational notions of storytelling, of that the act of speaking is the first way of storytelling.
Yes.
And they do of course. The lists all have to do with some kind of absence or sense of something being withdrawn, or something being non-present or unseeable. So in a way, it forces. I think it forces the possibility of imagining it telling stories of things that are no longer. So I do really respond to that notion that it might be somehow revealing of something otherwise forgotten, or otherwise put aside, or otherwise extinct.
But also like this, the extinct and the destroyed.
Yeah.
It also, let's say, connects to your own or to an ongoing fascination, let's say, about the immaterial, or like the things that are not visibly present, but part of our, let's say, thinking universe or feeling universe. But this time it's very interesting that you're talking about something like that is like destroyed, rather than, let's say, rather than a spirit or like a fragrance or like a ghost or a frequency. So why was this instinct to really like to go from that fragrance or like kind of objects like such immateriality to like thinking towards the extinct?
Well, I think the lists are entangled in those in earlier works. You know, so in references you're making to works that the audience may not know about, that relate to belief systems or ways of calling things into spaces, or looking to use olfactory experiences to think about the way objects extend beyond their physical or visible borders. That the lists are all entangled in this in forms of material forms that I've worked with before, and then extend outwards into the universe in new ways for me. So there are a lot of things to do with let's say aroma in the list. There's a list of discontinued fragrances, which runs into like 180 pages long. It reads for, I think it reads for 6 hours, that list. A list of banned aroma molecules, and through to transmissions as well, which is something else I've been working around and through, and thinking about the way objects have ways of extending into space. And so there's a lot of lists that deal with forms of transmission, or areas without transmission, and absences of transmission. So in a way, the lists are kind of they touch on and encapsulate a lot of other material interests, and they also suggest that nothing really vanishes. That if we think about the law of conservation of mass, that the planetary mass is impervious to life, death, production of any kind. That it's a constant. So the list. So there's a lot up for grabs in the list in terms of, there's a kind of questioning. There should be a questioning in the audience of how such a thing could be considered gone, or missing, or withdrawn, or a force of disappearance.
If we continue like thinking on the idea of the transmission, which is also another very, let's say, continuous methodology in your practice. Here in post-hoc, I see again like a kind of, let's say, a shift, or maybe again like another level up, because the transmission that we see also like the body as a container, not only a container but also a transmitter existing, also like in your work very much like audience as a participant, actually is also transmits in a way to enact the work or to complete the work, the cycle of the work.
Yeah, I mean, the works are producers of signals, as all objects or all things are. That all artworks could produce signals of some kind, and the work produces a signal in a very literal sense. It is the work is transmitted. Maybe this can go back into a little bit of description of what happens in the pavilion, which is that there is a thing called an object called a tapered anechoic chamber, and it's an echo-free chamber that's tapered in such a way. It's this particular form. It finds this particular shape because it allows for engineers to test fields of transmission coming from such things as antenna. It's a space for testing antenna aerials and things that produce electromagnetic transmission waves. And so what happens inside this box is this possibility of isolating the voice, isolating the sound, the speech act, to be materialized rather than be responsive to materials around it. When we hear something, it's through its reflective qualities that it bounces off things in order for us to hear it. It echoes, it bounces. It's through that reverberation that we hear something. So in the box, this is an impossibility. The sound is somehow contained. But but what happens inside this box is this beautiful thing that it creates the illusion of an infinite horizon. So that whatever's transmitted inside that box never bounces off anything. So it's a bit like dropping a pebble into a still body of water. It never ripples back. The sound is continuous and endless. And within this space, the sound is generated, and then it is literally transmitted out across Venice by way of a network of
I was about to continue.
of this network of objects called stealth cell towers. And I've worked with a company in Guangzhou, China, who produce these very peculiar, antagonistic, problematic objects. About 20 years ago, a company in the States started producing cell towers to support the telecommunications industry, disguised as trees. And people probably have seen these in the landscape in one place or another. And I've worked with a company who make these to produce a series of these trees that will be scattered across Venice as a sort of contagious field that do operate as transmitters. So they transmit the lists. They are both transmitting those lists by way of radio and also acoustically. And they are very clumsy, strange objects. They attempt to hide, but by doing so they stick out. They're a bit, in their attempt to go unnoticed, they start sort of screaming.
That's what I wanted to continue the question exactly. Like there is this artificial materiality, this kind of mass-produced artificial materiality that comes with these trees. I mean, they are let's say, they're imitating nature, but at the same time, it is impossible that imitation is already like a kind of a lost goal, and they look a little bit like spy with all the visible devices, like
Yeah.
that's so obvious in spying in a way.
Yeah, they scream.
They kind of scream out. And to me also, like in the way you're describing the project, these trees are almost a kind of, let's say, invading Venice, in a way, expanding the pavilion, like extending the pavilion space, but also like kind of invading Venice in a certain way. So can we...
Hopefully aesthetically too, I mean.
Yeah, can we think of this as a kind of your comment on like globalism in general? Because the object itself is also very, let's say, global product.
All of them.
I also would like to ask.
Yeah, I'd be really interested to hear Heman's thoughts on where these trees come from, because that's something that's really important to me in the project, is that all of the materials, they aren't, let's say, artified copies of the things. They are the things of which they claim to be. So working with a company who produced these cell towers was very important, as it is for me to have worked with an engineer and company that produced these particular chambers. And so these trees, they come from Guangzhou, China, which is a sort of an agglomeration of 5 cities that is essentially a kind of factory of the world. And I find it incredible that as a that humanity that we seek to kind of mimic. This is something that we have done since the beginning of time. We mimic nature, but that these trees, that somehow we seek to sort of to technify the natural environment through these trees. So by seeking to somehow make nature more useful, technologically speaking, these trees do this, and they are all pine trees. They're copies of Pinus radiata, which is the most prolifically grown tree in the world. And in New Zealand, we have a very sort of strange relationship to this tree. It's seen as an invasive species if grown outside a certain confined area in which it's deemed capital. So it's nature that's technology. It's not treated as nature, and it's a kind of technological tree. And so the tree, these cell towers kind of point to all of this stuff, that somehow this kind of technification of our landscape, both our built landscape and our natural landscape.
Yes.
And it would be my claim that actually all of our experiences of nature are technological, that when we go to a park, we are experiencing a kind of technified nature. And so, Can you
open it up a little bit? I think this is
So I wanted to hear from him a little bit about your thoughts on the trees and your experiences of Guangzhou, which is a city that we were talking about earlier today.
I think what is very interesting for me about these objects is that they refer heavily to infrastructure. And that, again, like what you have mentioned, is not exactly art objects that you're producing, but you're sort of latching onto a very prolific system that is already in production for something else. I've also seen a cactus version of the tree, which is hilarious because it's like what you would imagine of as a cactus, but sort of solely imagined by a bunch of Chinese workers in the factory who has actually never seen a cactus for real. So I think a lot of these structures are produced without any reference for scale. I think that's what's interesting for me. Every time I go to Guangzhou, that scale is a problem. Like they've never really seen a pine tree before. So like for me, like the needles are a bit too large, for example, So it's really an issue of scale that's interesting, that's also uncanny, like this is like weird, But I think this proliferates to everything else, right? Not only cell phone towers, but you have copies of Onkawara paintings, which are the wrong size, down to, let's say, like birthday balloons, like everything. I've always noticed that the great production centers of the world has copied things from images, and these images produce a kind of it's kind of like a guessing game, right? You're always trying to guess how big, how small, what actual material it is, and it's almost always wrong because of somehow like photography is a way of like oversheening something, So I think that in this sense, these productions are very much ingrained again in a lot of what you think about, you know, the unseen, but seen through something else, you know, and I think that's
Google.
exactly, and I think that's that makes a lot of sense for me. But I'm just curious, like, did the project? Have you always thought of these transmitters as trees? Did you think of another object that you could sort of like mimic? No.
I mean, the trees were kind of the first part of the project to arise.
So
Because I was thinking about garden. I mean, I guess I was thinking
Yeah.
about the Giardini as a
Yeah.
sort of strange template,
Yes,
which
yes.
is a geopolitical map of the world at a certain moment. You know, so there's
Yes.
like the UK up the top of the hill there, and,
Yes.
and you know,
It's
Israel
true.
and the United States sort of tucked around the corner together, and
Yeah.
so it's this very sort of strange environment, and it's a park, and parks are a kind of fiction. They're a kind of technological landscape, and so I was, and of course, again, much like the way New Zealand falls off the map of various moments and various places, we don't feature inside that landscape. You know, we're
Yes.
outside of it,
Yes.
and so the trees in a way became sort of a game of subterfuge, or a way to imagine participating in a garden without actually being there or something.
Yes.
So that was the kind of it was always the trees in a way, and they are a kind of an aesthetic assault on my own practice, let alone the landscape. You know, they are a kind of peculiar form, and yet they're one that I'm really I'm really curious to. I really love this idea that somehow there's that you know, as New Zealanders we seek to find identity through our natural environment. It's very important to us. And there's all of this kind of strange tension with these trees being somehow representative of a New Zealand pavilion, within a nationalistic framework of the Biennale, that there are these trees that, I mean, right now they're still at sea in a freight coming from China, soon to land in a port, and then to be sort of spread out across Venice and various locations. So the trees are kind of hosted by sites that also relate to the project in some ways. Like one is being hosted at the hospital in Venice, and
How many sites?
there's this kind of
It's a secret. Okay, next question.
no, there's it's including the pavilion. It's 5. But the other, like the hospital, was a really interesting place for me to think about as a place in which names are given to bodies.
Yes.
To people, where death is present, and where there's the microbial as kind of as a force. So the other spaces, hosted sites, do so as well. But that issue of scale is really interesting, I think, in terms of these places of mass production. I mean, what really struck me these are just some images of working research images. This is on my 2 trips that I made to Guangzhou to the factory, and what was really astounding is that often actual trees are used in the production of these fake trees in order to kind of better mimic nature. So casting is used. Casting is a process that's used, but there is always this this kind of wrongness, this kind of a slight wrongness to the scale of the form.
Or it's like the wrong texture.
Yeah.
Yeah, to me it reminds this whole the words themselves, you know, how like a certain method, like thinking through poetry, actually becomes like a guiding force in Google. Like when words are like completely, like they become living organisms, and they become like the words that would relate to certain facts for people to search. But not really that, so that it's living, but at the same time it's completely disconnected. So also like this comes, I think, also with the images that you find on Google as well, on a very similar principle. So
It's true. That's a disconnect.
And the lists are really problematic. They're a portrait of my filter bubble. Let's say, you know, the lists are only because it's not an algorithm that's built in order to go out and amass the lists. Actually, Heman's text with Anna as the character, the protagonist, who's one of the miners or researchers of one of the lists, is a really kind of, let's say, fair example of what that process is, which is making calls, asking somebody, searching something, going to a library, calling somebody who's interested in a certain subject, and trying to kind of pull together a list by way of, I mean, it has more to do with craft than it does technology, actually, the lists. They're very handmade. I mean, my indexical finger is swollen from...
Enter.
Yeah.
But you consider them as poetic gesture?
Yeah, for sure. I think the text is a kind of is a poem. I mean, the list of lists is certainly a sort of it's a poem. Absolutely.
But also very similarly, like the transmitter trees, you also decided to use a computer-generated voice to.
Yeah. So I mean, it seemed like a logical, maybe it's the wrong word, but it made sense to me to somehow think about these other forms of synthesis or syntheticness. And so in the same way that the trees do this kind of mimicking, that this voice is also a kind of mimicking force. And what I also love about this is that there's a sort of an indifference. The work is indifferent to us in a way, that it's continuous and ongoing regardless of our listening, so that it's...
But how do we feedback as audience? How do you imagine we feedback if you use cybernetics?
I think you're kind of lost in the data. I mean, so when you approach a tree, or you hear it, or you tune into it, you pick up its transmission, or you approach the pavilion, you're somehow swimming in this information. So you're kind of lost in the reading, and the reading is such that there is like a 2-second gap between each thing that's uttered, so that it's just held aloft before it sort of sinks back down into the past. So I'm really interested in the material weight of that speech act, to think about the voice or the mouth as a kind of sculptural organ, so to speak, that somehow by thinking about the act of saying something as being sculptural was really interesting to me, which the chamber does, because it isolates the voice as a form and then sends it over that infinite horizon.
Can we say like it becomes a special metaphor for like the mouth, like as the the transmitter, like the whole location, like the way you describe and design it?
I think so. And I mean, we were talking yesterday briefly about this way of maybe receiving the work, thinking of the audience again as being something that's somehow ingested, that I am interested in these forms of transmission that let's say permeate the eardrum, that reach the eardrum, or that reach the olfactory bulb in the brain, or that are resultant in breath being kind of materialized through things like glass. So that maybe that's another form of reception, reception both in terms of transmitted reception, but also an audience being a receiver of something. I mean, look at that green. It's kind of...
It's wrong, though.
It's really...
I mean, one of the first images of the tree is an earlier work. I made a work with and installed it on an island just near Auckland in New Zealand called Waiheke Island, and there's a sculpture park there. And it's a place that's, it's native bush, and it's a place where pines are being eradicated, like aggressively eradicated. And so I reintroduced this pine, and then I went back and saw it recently, and the color is altered again. I mean, it's becoming a kind of bluish green now as it fades in the sun.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah, it would be interesting, like to see them in Venice, like how after the whole sun, like what kind of, and humidity of the city, like what did they transform into also.
Yes.
Yeah, we were talking about humidity earlier, and so that we'll see about that. Yeah.
I would love to ask about the like source of the doubt that you have for scientific fact and scientific facts.
Right.
The nature of the scientific facts and the belief systems. Can you a little bit talk about where does this? I mean, and you play around it in a very beautiful way. But this doubt always comes in, and I'd love to hear a little bit about the origin of it.
I think I'm really interested in this possibility of doubt in the work, you know, that we might doubt the logic of which these lists are built, or doubt other aspects of other works. It's easier to talk about this work because we're kind of in front of it in a way. But yeah, I often say that I squint at science and that I squint at belief. You know, so in a way, it's not. I'm a generalist. I'm sort of outside of these propositions or proposals for ways of understanding the world as an artist. But I think there's really interesting methodologies at play in both systems of the production of scientific knowledge and in systems of belief. And so often my work is sort of somehow entangled in this messy relationship between the rational and the irrational, or the way that to speak of another work where I've worked a lot with homeopathy, which is a really interesting sort of framework for...
As we are in the also land of homeopathy.
Yeah,
interesting.
Where it was invented, and so, you know, that it was invented by a physician, that it comes from science, but that it has a relationship to magical
Alchemy.
practices and alchemy, and you know, to sympathetic magic, and it's a framework for misunderstanding or understanding material, and so I think doubt that an audience might approach a work from a position of doubt, I think, is a really interesting agitating force. And opens up all kinds of possibilities for engagement, which I think you liken to a kind of reception or transmission too. Yeah. So it's another way of making a messy signal, like the signal being somehow a little bit sort of static in the air. Erratic and staticky. Yeah. Heman does that too, I think.
Yes, exactly. That's why I would like to also continue the question, because the character Anna O, she also has a strong doubtful position in the story,
yes.
Or there is a clear let's say ponderance around doubt in that story. So can you maybe talk about your relationship to doubt in this way?
The entire narrative occurs in between two books that she's writing. So she's finished one, which is kind of mildly successful, and then she's sort of searching for something to work on next. And I think that something that I think about a lot is the idea of downtime, what artists do when they're not making art, and that so much of downtime is also associated with work. So in a way, I think the novel also questions the very essence of labor, and what is it that we are actually doing when we are sort of spending time doing nothing. It's obviously not a waste, but at the same time, it's not visibly productive. And I think on many levels, it functions a little like the list, I feel, that it's not immediately sort of useful, but it would be to some persons associated with a certain list, you know? And I think that this kind of utilitarianism is very, very, I have a very tenuous relationship to it, coming from a country that only knows how to instrumentalize art for its own political purposes. So it's also a lot to do with this idea of what is it that we're doing as artists within the framework of a larger political agenda around us, right? That do we then conform to this master plan, or do we resist, or do we defy it? And I think the character within the novel is grappling with all of it, literally all of it at this point. And there's also a kind of suggestion, I hope at the end, that there is a kind of awakening. I think that's interesting.
It's also a kind of an escape at the end, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's kind of an escape, which is also a kind of re-looking at certain things in her life. Yeah.
But also loss.
I mean, in a way, your novel is lost too, really, because it's a dispersed novel in which each chapter appears in another
Yes.
Publication.
Yes, and that each chapter is edited by a different editor, and everything is sort of set adrift. And I think finally, I've sort of spoken with my publisher that also when we finally sort of put it all together, that it will not be bound, and that it would just be like sort of a mess within a bag or something, you know. And that I think it's very important. I think it's important
Plastic bag, like a bag.
when we talk about doubt to actually talk about doubt. That it's not a kind of a structured mode in talking about it. That you encounter it, you know, and that it's really through this encounter that you sort of understand how different sort of like approaches to doubt would sort of like surface, you know.
Yeah, because I always feel like doubt is always, let's say, also standing at the root of artistic practice, but standing also a lot in the root of fictional practices as well. Like this attempt to create another level of the world is coming from like not believing or not feeling complete with the world that exists as such.
Yes.
If you don't mind, may I ask, like,
Yes.
how does writing arrive in your work?
Right.
Because you have a very particular practice
Yes.
of writing and of fiction in your work.
Yes.
And it's not only like, let's say, artist writing on the side, but the writing itself becomes also like the work. So.
I think a lot of this is informed by the fact that in Singapore real estate prices are very, very high. We're talking about like
What real estate you say?
yes,
Yeah, right,
yes. Like it's very expensive to have space, and my strategy is then to whenever I start to think about an image or an object, that I would write about it because it takes up no space. So the sketch is then always a text that would describe the object, and I think this is where a lot of the writing practice come from, which later sort of like mutates into fiction. At the same time, I think that it's true that it's not so much a kind of alibi, like writing is not an alibi for the work I do within spaces.
Yeah.
That it's not something that would prop up my work, but it's a thing on its own.
I mean, you kind of treat it materially too. I really
Yes,
liked
yes.
that interview where you talked about how you only use this font and this size
Yes,
and
yes.
this program. So it sort of materializes the text.
Yeah, yeah. I
Isn't
can
it?
only write in simple text, Times New Roman at 9 point.
Not
Like
even
I just
analytical?
cannot,
Okay.
I just cannot do it in any other way. Like when an editor sends me back a Word document with all that changes, I have to like look at it and then rewrite everything in simple text. I just cannot figure it out.
I mean, I just really like the way that materializes
Yes,
the,
yes.
the process so nice.
Well, in a way, I mean, can we say like that your novel is really finished? So because
No.
for me, yes, I mean there are certain commissions that are connected to each other, but
Yes.
not necessarily. It's a novel with an open end. No, it's almost like an eternally incomplete in a way.
Yes and no, but I feel that even within that randomness, there is a kind of implied structure, and at this point it's not complete because a part of it is still missing. Let's say in my mind,
yeah.
yes.
But I really like that. I mean, the structure itself already suggests a certain incompleteness,
Yes.
and that would continue, or like kind of giving your reader, your audience, like already an expectation as such.
Yes. I think when you're involved in writing fiction, you also start to have a conversation with your characters, and at this point, Anna is telling me to stop. So I think in a
Okay,
way,
so she
like
defines-
after
she's the ruler of the planet.
yes.
Ah.
So I feel like she's telling me to like let go of it,
No.
as well.
Well, if she needs some work being a researcher to help
Maybe we can like do an exchange.
Yeah, she can be on residency with you.
That's great. I would love to connect like this idea of the incomplete and almost like kind of, I would say, radical incomplete to your work, because to my feeling, the whole interest in the tension between materiality and immateriality is such an ongoing act of that kind of translation that wouldn't actually like stop anywhere. This, for me, idea is a kind of very precious because it's one of the theorists that really inspires me, Akbar Abbas. He speaks about radical incomplete actually as an essential almost to the critical thinking. If an idea is complete in itself, it's already naturally stops its progress and innovation and also stops its critical notion.
Yeah,
so that's why I'd like to connect.
Yeah, I mean, the lists are desperately incomplete. They can,
There's like we talk about the Bermuda evil triangle.
Yeah, the Bermuda Triangle, yeah. I mean, the work, the lists are, I mean, they embrace the fallibility of encyclopedic thinking, that somehow this notion that, you can build a list that would somehow hold all vanished and withdrawn and obsolete materials within it is an impossible notion. So from the very kind of from the very beginning of starting to build this list, there is radical incompleteness that the work is entangled in a kind of in that mess. It's entangled in this in the inability for the work to do the thing that it attempts to do, which let's say in the procedural aspect of doing this thing, that's a really problematic, because I approach it very rationally. I approach it with a kind of methodology that's like, okay, I'm going to make this list now, and yet I'm always entangled in the incompleteness of the act. The shortest list is 1 word long, and the longest list I think reads for it's the full New Zealand paleontological record reads for 8 days. And, and actually fossils are really interesting in terms of their kind of incompleteness, that they are absences in themselves. They are forces of absence. And that somehow, this kind of incompleteness of the project is certainly, it's real.
Yes.
I think this realness is a good point to also open up for audience if they have any questions.
I think so.
The darkened audience.
The darkened audience.
Can I have some?
That I've had my back to. I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
of course.
Thank you. You want some too?
I will, but I will first.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Dane, can I ask one question? I was curious when I saw the list, because it's obsolete and things which have vanished, but you had one which says a list of future solar eclipses.
When I started, I was thinking about eclipses as moments of vanishing, these sort of temporal vanishings of either the moon or the sun. And so I was thinking about making a collection of all of those moments that has occurred, or a kind of list of those. And it occurred to me that actually we can predict those vanishings. So it seemed more interesting to think about the next century of solar and lunar vanishings. So what is actually named, what is uttered, are the dates of those future eclipses. So it runs until, for 100 years. It's a 100-year list of those future vanishing acts. And another one that has the word future in it is the list of former futures exchanges. So this is, like stock exchanges, but futures exchanges, exchanging in the future value of commodities. So future exchanges that are now no longer. So this idea of from a former futures sort of is present throughout as well.
Sense.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of sort of active use of verbs, and I mean, things are dissolved or eradicated or or become obsolete or made extinct. So there's a full range of things across, and there's a lot of things to do with time, things that measure time or measure space that are listed as well. That are, yeah.
Other questions?
William.
Thank you. Dane and Heman, how did it come to be that you guys are working together for this publication?
That's a good question. Yeah.
I don't know.
He doesn't know.
I got a call.
I think it was Zara.
There was money involved. I said yes.
I think it was curatorial matchmaking.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah,
it was a cold call, right?
It was a call. Yeah, it was a cold call. Yeah, there was. I mean, actually, the project has lots of different sort of, let's say, lovely run-ins with people that I've known for a period of time. So I've known Heman for I don't know, a long time. We met in probably.
But it's kind of like we're always like ships passing.
I mean, we've seen each other in different parts of the world, and in particular in our region, let's say in the Asia Pacific region. And so I've always been really attuned to and interested in Heman's work. And when Zara and Chris and I were starting to formulate what this publication might be, Heman's name came up, and I was like, "Oh my God, that's perfect!" It makes a lot of sense in relationship to Heman's library project, to the book being this kind of dispersed form, and actually Heman's text does something really important in the publication. It introduces this aspect of fiction, because otherwise, there's kind of description and kind of conceptual frameworks being built around the work. But Heman's work sort of sits inside the work. It's entangled in my work in a really interesting way. So the moment his name kind of came up, I was like, yeah, let's see if he can do it. Let's find some money for him. Let's motivate him. No.
I said yes straight away.
Immediate.
It was like, ka-ching.
I encountered those trees a couple of times, and always they were related to private infrastructure. Like, in what way? Like, you had a much more extensive, probably, encounter with those trees. But can you? Is there not like also something specific that they like are part of a particular infrastructure, not like infrastructure per se?
Yeah, well, the company, when I was there at the factory, you might have seen these phoenix palms. There was an image of some phoenix palms, and that was a contract. They were making 4,000 of those for a freeway in India, each one which would hold some kind of infrastructural support, be it, related to traffic control or traffic kind of monitoring, to weather, to Wi-Fi, to all kinds of, let's say, infrastructural systems that are supported by those phoenix palms that will run down a freeway in India. Certainly, I'm really interested again in the way that we are all involved in this invisible network through our telephones, through our telecommunication industry. But of course, this is all supported by hardware. I mean, there's physical stuff that allows us to have that momentary engagement with something that seems ephemeral, but it's held up by all of this gear. And these trees are those is that gear. They are those things that allow for that support to attempt to sit inside the landscape without damaging a view, perhaps, and yet doing the complete opposite. But yeah, I mean, they're used mainly so this company in Guangzhou produced them for clients and that would use them, as I mentioned, in freeways, or for say telecommunications networks in particular, that they would be commissioned contracted to produce a series of trees for a landscape. They do a lot of work in the Middle East but not so much in the States. There's a kind of domestic market for that.
Yes.
Do you know the production? like the how many trees that they produce? Like, did they give an overall estimate?
Actually, I'm not sure. I mean, they also make artificial plants for malls and other sorts of interior environments as well. So they run about 4 factories and a showroom, and so it's this kind of
It's a mall.
It's it's
It's IKEA. IKEA
really
infrastructure.
it's a catalog.
IKEA.
You could probably order them from. Yeah. So I hope that answers a little bit, maybe, your question. They're not free. Yeah. There's actually when they started these trees, the first kind of name that they were given informally was that they were called Frankenpines, and they were seen as a real affront to rural landscapes in the United States when they first started appearing in the 1980s. So I'm not sure that that's actually the case, that that's where they appear. I mean, maybe in a kind of, like, let's say, as if they're employed for aesthetic purposes only, or some kind of monitored low, let's say, surveillance, kind of to support some surveillance gear in a gated community, as you mentioned. Perhaps they're also employed in that way. But the company, their cell tower production is such that they're making them for a range of kinds of contexts.
To me, I immediately imagine them in the Gulf, particularly in the Gulf region, like that kind of artificiality and like that kind of play of effluence that comes with it at the same time. I think it really fits in the Gulf context for me, like was a kind of a natural habitat.
I've never seen one in the Gulf, though. I go there quite a lot.
Near Singapore?
I see them a lot in Manila, in the Philippines. Because there's also sort of a way. It's also a way for them to sort of negotiate greenness into the city, and it's not so much in like sort of rich areas or gentrified areas. I think it's like more like a government contract sort of thing. It might be corruption. They might have to do something to do with the factory or something. But I would say, like, my different encounters with it have been quite arbitrary.
Okay.
And I think that that's one reason why I don't think it would be in the Gulf, is because the sun would melt them. It would literally be too hot with the plastic.
But
I think.
There are all these malls basically with all the air conditioning that people live with. So actually, I think they're probably in the malls. That maybe you didn't. Have you been to the malls? I think it's kind of a mall situation. But anyway,
I've seen a lot of it.
It's all these scenarios that come with it.
Right. Maybe you're right. But I'm just thinking on the outside,
it's impossible.
It's impossible.
Yeah, it's impossible, of course. Another question?
What is the conditions that you base the past upon? So it's a list of things that connect to the past, and as time is different to different cultures, I'm wondering what your conditions are.
What the conditions are of what determines the lists.
Exactly.
It's completely subjective. It's an invention. It's my own invention. It's a poetic invention. It attempts to be somewhat encyclopedic. So there are no people named on the list. That was really kind of important to me from the get-go. That there are certainly events that the lists produced. There are names on the list. So, for example, retired hurricane names, which are people's names like Sandy and Glenda, and but these are
all women's names.
But and these are all retired. So they become retired. Sorry. So there are no people, there are no bodies on the list in that direct sense. But it's an invention. I mean, it's my hope that the lists might be problematic in an understanding of what's present or not, or what could be considered vanished, obsolete, or gone, or deferred, or a kind of force a force that inevitably leads to a kind of vanishing of some kind. So they're kind of intuited, and it's a kind of poem as we mentioned. So yeah, it's the material of the work really that I've built. Yeah, does that help? Amy?
No, okay.
You make a list of your former what?
My former what?
Work. Your former work.
Yeah, actually, one list. I mean, there could be. Yeah, there's certainly. I have to stop somewhere. Sit down. I've had to kind of call it now. I'm still processing because the process is very hands-on. Like there's a lot of labor in me producing these lists. I mean, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, list of lists.
Yeah.
There's one, I think a hand I saw. Okay.
Dane, I just have a question regarding the materiality of the voice. You speak about the material of the speech act, and I'm just wondering, who are the voices that you're working with? And maybe also for Herman as a question with your character, could you describe your character in a material way? Is there a materiality to the voice?
Shall I start? Yeah, it's a synthetic voice in the same way that the trees are. It's a digital voice. It's a simulated human voice. She has a name, right? Her name is Amy, and like the trees, like the chamber, the voice is a kind of existing technology. It's an Amazon product, and her name's Amy. She has an English accent.
Victorian English.
Yeah, Eva thinks it's Victorian. I mean, it was really, I wanted this sort of slightly authoritative, sort of imperialist kind of slight, authoritative kind of accent or voice. And there are no New Zealand accents within that kind of realm of. So we vanish in that space too, actually. So it was important that it was an existing voice, and in the same way that the trees mimic, the voice is a kind of mimic form of mimicry as well. So it's kind of it's a no one, but it's generic. It's a generic, possibly anyone. Heman.
Anna, I think the best way to describe her is that if you're coming from Singapore, you would like almost immediately recognize her, like the voice at least. It's very sort of clipped voice, where we speak in a different kind of English. It's called Singlish, where we sort of drop verbs and introduce other things, and it's completely incomprehensible to everyone else. I guess what I'm trying to say is when I started on this project to use Anna as a protagonist, there was a lot of concern on my side that I would be appropriating a female voice. And I was very aware of this. At the same time, I think that it's something that I'm very conscious about, of writing as a female writer in her 30s who's living in Singapore. And it's, again, a way for me to produce empathy. And I think that it's very important that I would immerse myself in this voice in order to gain a kind of traction, I think, with the narrative itself. I do think a lot about her voice. I think a lot about how she looks. I think a lot about like what she wears. I've also began at some point to like talk with her, like to have conversations with her. But at the same time, again, like I would never like try to reproduce his voice in any other way except through the fiction. Like I don't believe in like trying to recreate this voice like in an installation, for example, simply because then there's no real function then of literature. So I think that yeah, I guess that's how I would sort of flesh out the whole thing.
Just a little curiosity before the next question. Has she ever taken ghostwriting projects also? Anna?
No.
No?
Yeah, no.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
One of the most interesting aspects of being in an anechoic chamber for me is that it produces also a kind of physical disorientation, right? So usually we use the reflections that aren't happening in that space to make assumptions about the material of walls, the angle of walls, how far away we are from objects in front of us. So it produces this sense of disorientation, much in the same way I imagine seeing those trees does. I've never seen one up close, but there's a kind of uncanny valley aspect to it. So we think it's a tree, we think it's going to function as a tree, and we get close enough and it doesn't quite behave as we expect. Similarly, the language of those lists, it's like, it looks like cool, calm, bureaucratic, colonial, demarcation of the world, and yet once you get into the content of those lists, it has this poeticism and this darkness and this kind of other, it behaves not as the sort of form suggests it will behave. And I guess I imagine the cumulative impact of those as a receiver or a viewer would be really quite moving and quite dark, actually. And it seems really like, it seems almost like a post-apocalyptic taxonomy of the present, right? You're not going future. I guess some of the events haven't happened yet, but it's really of the now. But it has this kind of, this darkness and this pull to it. And yet, when I hear you talk about the work, you seem to really, you mention the sculptural aspects of the voice as though that chamber were interesting, kind of devoid of the textual content that was being expressed. I hear you like describing being interested in lists as a kind of rational exercise. So I'm wondering how comfortable you are claiming, and you kind of mentioned it's not a moral stance, it's not a story. Like, how comfortable are you claiming a critical stance here, and or am I right, is it going to accumulate into a kind of darkness, and if so, how comfortable are you with that affect?
Yeah, good question.
Good question.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, the work floats all of that, right? Like, it's an attempt to float those possibilities for the work to be caught up in that problem. The problem of this, like, staggering accretion of loss that is present in these lists. And the lists do kind of flip between the flippant and the charged, the really kind of poignantly weighted, and they are full of they are full of sadness, but the lists are full of sadness, and actually the gathering of that data has been really confronting in that way. I mean, coming from an island, we are overrepresented in those lists in relationship to the environment in terms of loss, like staggering amounts of loss in relationship to the peculiarities of island ecologies. So I mean, the work's new, so I'm still trying to think about all of those things. I'm still figuring out ways to talk about it, I think, which is maybe why I'm hedging my bets around what the work might do, because it hasn't happened yet. But I think one thing to say about the chamber is that the chamber is not something that the viewer goes into. Again, you're sort of on the outside of it. You view the reading occurring inside the chamber, but you're not inside it yourself. So again, that seems like an important clarification, that somehow, again, you're not experiencing that. You're somehow witnessing it from a distance. So the lists. And I think this rational framework of listing and encyclopedic thinking is that it's somehow this impossible task of kind of holding all of that loss. And they are, there's a lot of heartbreak inside those lists, but there's also, they're not all negative. They're not all negative. There are things like cured diseases, for example, or I don't know, things that perhaps we can be glad there are no more. But yeah.
Is there a world after the list?
I don't. I have to stop.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Should we
wrap it?
Yeah.
I guess.
It kind of connects to the last one, I think. We heard about storytelling in the beginning, and then it made me think about the connection between storytelling and resistance, and if there is one, and then thinking about your work and also your interest in archives or archiving things or non-things, I don't know. I wanted to ask you if you see, I mean, your position somehow also as a position of resistance, or being interested or also activating archives as an act of resistance, if that is something you can kind of, or not. I mean,
I mean, one thing that makes me think of is the image that we used for the invitation for tonight, which was this image of this petri dish, which is from a series of works that I've been making since 2003, and it's called the Dust Archive, and it's a collection of dust that I've accumulated a collection of dust from museums from around the world. And then I, culture bacteria from that dust and have it analyzed or photographed, the bacterial cultured growth, photographed from these institutions that seek to somehow hold on to, retain, and claim and hold cultural artifacts and knowledge. And that dust is a material that makes that an impossibility. In a sense, that somehow, if we think about a different kind of a certain kind of geological time scale, that somehow this is an impossible task to hold on to things, and that dust is the thing that objects become, but it's also a material that speeds up this process of decay and entropy. And that image it's dust that I collected from the National Museum in Rio de Janeiro that burned to the ground last year. And that loss is kind of staggering in terms of the volume of material knowledge that's gone. And that dust I collected and have just, I think in 2004 or 3, 4, or 5, I collected that dust, and it's been sitting sort of dormant in the collection. So, this activation of archival materials, and somehow this is something that's kind of ongoing. So I think there's a clear relationship between that work and this, in terms of its this activation of a collection in a way, the way that the lists sit dormant but become active through reading, and the way that the dust sits dormant and then become active through culturing, like literal culturing.
What is transmitted? Why transmitted?
Why transmit?
Yeah, I don't know. Usually transmission is as well used in education to give some things to the one to come.
I mean,
you're transmitting things which disappeared or vanished, but you transmit it anyway. So it's transmitted for something to come anyway. So
I mean, I think about transmission as perhaps a way to extend a reach of an object or of an idea beyond the kind of the moment in which it might occur. So, in a way, thinking about these trees as a kind of transmitted network across the city is a way to sort of activate this. Think about the work as a sort of a field of contagion across the city, where the transmission is occurring and radiating off of those objects. So somehow, for me, it's a way to think about, again, an object extending beyond its physical edges. It's a way to think about that electromagnetic activity radiating off a thing as being somehow a part of it. So the logic of transmission, or my use of transmission, is a way to send that material beyond its physical boundaries.
But to whom?
To whom? In a way, the work doesn't require a listener. I mean, the work.
I'm thinking about this idea of darkness in the work.
Yeah.
At the end, I think if you're transmitting something, it means there's some openness behind that. So. There are 3 or 4 lists that all relate to Voyager 1 and 2, these space probes that have left the solar system.
I think thinking about them as objects that are drifting at incredible speeds away from us to never be encountered again is a kind of metaphor inside the lists, but also a way to think about a form of transmission that kind of that's reaching outwards, but impossible to experience beyond an idea. So I think there are 3 lists like anthropogenic sounds that have left the solar system, and that's the list of all of the recordings on the golden record, which are attached to the side of the probe, and the images as well that were, and then all of the mechanical gear attached to those as well. So I think that's a really that those Voyager probes are a really interesting and meaningful kind of metaphor for me to think about transmission as not necessarily needing to be picked up for it to kind of have effect or be in existence, maybe. And we'll talk down.
Well,
Yeah.
shall we
Should we wrap up?
Yeah, shall we wrap up?
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.